Reading history is probably one of the most important things we can do. The way to gain knowledge is to look at history and learn from people who came before us. So what does history say about a real capitalist and a fake one? So let's see what kind of capitalist Elon Musk is. What is a real capitalist and what is a fake capitalist? Let's get this history lesson started.
What we have to distinguish between are the capitalists, the industrialists who operate on the free market, and the kind of capitalists who operate with government help.
Ayn Rand just said that there are two different capitalists, one who does it in the free market and one that does it with government help. So which one is Elon? Is he a true capitalist or a fake one?
Tesla generated a jaw-dropping $1.79 billion in regulatory credit revenue last year. That brought the cumulative total Tesla has raked in since 2009 to almost $9 billion.
So since 2009, Tesla has received $9 billion for carbon credits. Every Model 3 that you buy, you get 7,500 EV credits. I thought he was against subsidies.
He's saying get rid of all subsidies, in favor of deleting subsidies.
He wants to remove all subsidies, but in 2024, when I go on the website, they still get $7,500 tax credit.
They just delete them all.
He's in favor of removing subsidies, even though he has received billions and billions and billions of them. He just can't stop taking that government money.
Access and favors were sold for cash. It's called pay for play.
Labeling themselves as consultants and advisors when we all know that really what they are is lobbyists.
Trump said a lot of the right things, but he did nothing of it.
He made government bigger. That's going in the wrong direction. And every single one I could see, there were more employees after his presidency than before.
He did cut a few things, but overall spending under Trump nearly doubled.
He increased government spending and gave checks to everybody. Let's go back to Ayn Rand and listen to history.
Since the United States has been a mixed economy from the beginning, not a fully free capitalist country, but merely the freest up to that point in history.
United States used to be one of the freest economies in the world.
There were government controls and government interference into the economy from the beginning. Only these controls were marginal and minimal and were not able, at first, to hamper the magnificent progress of this country.
The United States had marginal, minimal government interference in the economy, and it didn't hamper the magnificent progress of the country.
There are two ways to get rich, and only two. One is to produce your wealth and to trade with other people by voluntary trade to mutual benefit.
So one way to get rich is to freely trade with other people without any help from the government. And what is the second way to get rich?
Or to acquire wealth by force. To acquire it by force, one must be either an actual criminal or a legalized criminal, that is, a man who uses the power of government to grant him special privileges not possessed by his competitors, and thus to acquire wealth by legalized force, by the force of law.
So not only did he receive billions and billions from the government subsidies, but the government also kept telling us that they will end gas-powered cars by 2035, literally forcing us to buy electric cars. Not only did they force us, but they also forced the producers to make electric cars. Biden says that the EP regulations ensure the nation meets his goal of 50% of all new car sales are electric by 2030. Also 3 years ago he set ambitious targets that half of the new cars and trucks sold in 2030 would be zero emissions. The government is really shoving EVs down our throat, just as Ayn Rand said.
To acquire it by force, one must be either an actual criminal or a legalized criminal, that is, a man who uses the power of government to grant him special privileges not possessed by his competitors, and thus to acquire wealth by legalized force, by the force of law.
This helped Tesla because nobody else was making electric cars, besides Fisker, but they went bankrupt.
Both kinds of capitalists existed in this country from the beginning, and this is the crucial point. All the evils popularly ascribed to capitalists and to capitalism in the 19th century were actually committed by government interference into the economy, by those capitalists who were not free enterprisers, who did not function by free market competition and did not rise by merit, or not by merit exclusively, but predominantly and primarily by government help.
Ludwig von Mises wrote a long time ago, every government intervention in the marketplace creates unintended consequences, which leads to calls for further government interventions. So the government subsidized EV companies like Fisker, which went bankrupt, just as Mises and Ayn Rand wrote long time ago. But I'm gonna tell you a small secret nobody thinks of. Government actually gave the biggest subsidy on earth to these electric companies that nobody talks about. But let's get back to Ayn Rand before I tell you this massive subsidy they received.
The situation existed in the history of the railroads. The railroad which aroused the greatest popular resentment, with some justice, was the Central Pacific of California, now known as the Southern Pacific. This was one of the two railroads built by government subsidies. This was the first transcontinental railroad. In the 19th century, the government gave subsidies to the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific to private groups to create a transcontinental railroad building from both ends of the continent. In both cases, the main motive of the men involved in building this railroad, though not the exclusive, but the main motive, was to acquire the subsidies, not to build a railroad.
So I'm gonna be honest here, we can give Elon credit that he actually made a car. He didn't just take the subsidies and ran off with them, they actually built something. And now let's continue.
More than that, there was yet no economic need for a transcontinental railroad. There was not enough freight to carry to justify private investment. But the government, under propaganda similar to today's, and such excuses as the prestige of the country, decided to build a railroad, and it did so by means of giving subsidies to private groups.
Is it just me, or we're doing the exact same thing today? We subsidize everything just to build electric cars.
So that's why I'm here today, to announce $2.4 billion in highly competitive grants to develop the next generation of fuel-efficient cars and trucks powered by the next generation of battery technologies, all made right here in the US of A. Right here in America. Made in America. You know, for too long, we failed to invest in this kind of innovative work, even as countries like China and Japan were racing ahead. And that's why this announcement's so important. This represents the largest investment in this kind of technology in American history. See, I'm committed to a strategy that ensures America leads in the design and the deployment of the next generation of clean energy vehicles. This is not just an investment to produce vehicles today, this is an investment in our capacity to develop new technologies tomorrow.
And we did all of this to save the climate. So let's see how it ended last time government did subsidies in this scale.
Now this is a classic example of a capitalist of a mixed economy, that is a man who rises not by merit and economic judgment, but by government pull and special privilege. The builders of this Continental Railroad had an advantage which no private competitor could match. They had government subsidies. As a consequence, the Central Pacific held a monopoly in the state of California for about 30 years.
While now we have been subsidizing EVs since 2008. Some of Tesla's $25 billion in second quarter revenue came from cars competitors didn't sell. Tesla, which only sells electric cars, always has an excess of credits. It's the advantage Tesla needs amid the slow start to 2024, just like Ayn Rand said.
Not only did they have the original advantage, but controlling and bribing the legislature of California, they had laws passed which forbade the entry of any competitor into California.
You know, so Elon endorsed me recently, the other day, but he gives me 45
million a month.
I'm no saint, but I generally try to do the right thing.
A month. Not 45 million. Gives me 45 million a month.
But controlling and bribing the legislature of California.
And I'm for electric cars. I have to be, because Elon endorsed me very strongly, Elon. So I have no choice. But he knows.
Controlling and bribing.
So why did Elon Musk pledge to give 45 million per month to Trump?
We're going to put a 100% tariff on every single car that comes across the line, and you're not going to be able to sell those cars if I get elected.
I wonder why. Back to Ayn Rand.
To be exact, the law forbade any competing railroad to enter any California port. And since most of the freight traffic came through the ports, it meant that no railroad could survive economically in the state of California if it did not have access to the port.
Since 2015, United States has spent $187 billion on different EV subsidies. And for consumers' incentives, it has spent $7.5 billion, while China has spent $230 billion last 15 years. So what's gonna happen to these sales when this biggest subsidy of them all gets removed? Which nobody talks about, and I'm gonna tell you at the end of this video. Now back to Ayn Rand.
Several attempts were made by competing private companies to break that monopoly of the Central Pacific in California, and of course they failed. Now the Central Pacific engaged in truly immoral and improper economic practices. Namely, they changed their freight rates arbitrarily every year, charging as much as the farmers produced, leaving them practically nothing as profit and barely any seed for the next harvest. Now, the statist collectivist intellectuals, of course, blamed the railroad.
Who will they blame if Tesla went bankrupt? I mean, Fisker went bankrupt already.
US electric vehicle maker Fisker filed for bankruptcy protection late Monday. It's looking to sell assets and restructure its debts.
Who starts a car company and a rocket company expecting them to succeed? Certainly not me. I thought they both had less than a 10% chance of success. And frankly, I wasn't wrong in that in 2008, we had the third failure of SpaceX, and if the fourth launch had failed, SpaceX would be dead in 2008. We had no money for a fifth launch. And for Tesla, Tesla's been on the verge of bankruptcy many times. And we closed the financing round in 2008, because remember, at the end of 2008, General Motors and Chrysler were going bankrupt, and Ford was almost bankrupt. So imagine trying to raise money for an electric car startup while General Motors is going bankrupt. And people were angry that I even asked. But we were able to just barely raise enough money to squeak by and close the financing round for Tesla on the last hour of the last day that it was possible in Christmas Eve 2008.
So let's check how Tesla is doing.
All dressed up and nowhere to go. 2,000 Teslas arrive here at Port Melbourne every month, but there's no buyers to take them home.
All of a sudden we've got a huge backlog of Teslas that aren't moving. They've just stopped moving.
Tesla sales slumped 44% in April, despite the US car giant making multiple and significant price cuts to its fleet.
It isn't going so well, is it? And who are they gonna blame if this company goes bankrupt? It's not the government's fault, it's the oil industry's fault. It's always somebody else's fault. Now back to Ayn Rand.
The famous novel by Frank Norris, Octopus, denouncing the railroads, was based on the activity of the Central Pacific and was the foundation for the enormous popular hatred of railroads. Yet observe who was the villain in the picture. Not private enterprise, not the free market, but an act of government.
$2.4 billion in highly competitive grants.
Originally the subsidies of the federal government and then reinforced by the legislation of California, which maintained the monopoly of the Central Pacific and permitted it to engage in all such abuses, delivering the public into its power. It is an act of government. Special privileges is required to establish any kind of coercive monopoly, and the history of the Central Pacific is a classic example of it. It was the government and the legislature that was guilty of the abuses involved. Instead of identifying this fact, it was free enterprise, the free market, that took the blame.
So who are we going to blame that Fisker went bankrupt? Of course, the government is gonna blame the free market and not themselves. Back to this brilliant woman.
If it is asked whether it's a question of dishonest legislatures, it is not. The issue there is that no legislator who has the power of control can be either honest or dishonest. The dishonesty lies not in the person, but in the institution. When a government holds arbitrary power over the economy, no matter what the controls and regulations, they will necessarily be unjust because they will necessarily be weighted by force in favor of one group of people at the expense of the other.
Same as today, the gasoline cars are subsidizing the EV cars by forcing them to buy ZEV credits.
The proper lesson to have learned should have been the realization that government controls can create only harm, injustice, and distortions in the economy and should be repealed. The government should not have had the power to interfere into the economy. It should not have held economic power. But since indeed, and so long as it did, the abuses necessarily had to take place with each control leading to further and more disastrous controls.
So the whole problem is that the government should never have control over the economy, so it can dictate to us what we can buy, what we can do, or anything. This is not the role of the government. Joe Biden is a perfect example of that. He's a senile old man who doesn't know what planet we've been on, and he's been the president. He doesn't even know where the hell he is. He is the perfect definition of why we don't need somebody running our life. We are perfectly able to control our own lives. We don't need the government tell us to buy cars. So what happened last time the government told us to buy houses?
I do believe in the American dream. Owning a home is a part of that dream. It just is. Right here in America, if you own your own home, you're realizing the American dream. First, the single greatest barrier to first-time home ownership is a high down payment. It is really hard for many, many low-income families to make the high down payment. And so that's why I've proposed and urged Congress to fully fund the American Dream Down Payment Fund. This will use money, taxpayers' money, to help a qualified low-income buyer make a down payment.
So the government used taxpayers' money to make everybody buy a house. And what happened then? What are the results of government intervening in the economy?
The stock market is now down 21%.
Because we're now down 43%.
What in the world is happening on Wall Street?
Two-year no yields went from 190 to 166 in the blink of an eye.
On the NASDAQ, everything and more has been completely wiped out.
It was the worst day on Wall Street since the crash of 1987.
The results were the biggest financial crisis since 1987. This is what happens when the government intervenes in the economy. And then the government blamed the private sector, the banks and Wall Street, while the government ordered them to buy a house.
If one of the goals is to increase home ownership, it makes sense to help people pay that down payment.
Really, you're seeing just broad-based declines across all of the major technology sectors. Apple's under pressure, Yahoo down 8.5%, Cisco 6.5%, Research in Motion 10%.
There is a lack of affordable housing in certain neighborhoods.
Look at it after you buy it. It's so horrible.
But we've had an 8-day losing streak in the Dow that in percentage terms puts it on par, close to the loss suffered in that crash in 1987, close to that percentage loss those 2 days in 1929.
So last time government told us to buy houses, and this time they told us to buy electric cars. How confident are you that this is not gonna end well? This is what happens when the governments intervene in the economy. Total fiasco.
Lack affordable housing units. How can you promote home ownership if people can't afford the home?
America last year has now spread to every part of the world.
We're down 9% today. The Xetra DAX over in Frankfurt is down by 9%. The Paris market down by 9%. Austria, which was briefly suspended earlier on in the day, is down by nearly 11%.
This market is as volatile as you'll ever see.
Traders saying this is the craziest day they have ever seen in these markets. Veteran traders saying they've never seen anything.
And what does Ayn Rand have to say about this?
To this day, people have not yet grasped that lesson. And whenever anything goes wrong in any industry, it is always the free market, the free capitalist that takes the blame.
How can you promote home ownership if people can't afford the home?
And I stress this without exception. If you investigate, you will always find that the source of the evils or the abuses was the government.
$2.4 billion.
What I've done is propose what we call a single-family affordable housing tax credit to encourage the development of affordable housing in neighborhoods where housing is scarce.
Government controls, not free enterprises or the free market.
So, to help overcome that barrier and get more people into electric vehicles, the federal government pays buyers of a select group of EVs a subsidy of up to $5,000.
So the government is doing the exact same thing they did in 2002, telling people to buy houses, but this time it's not houses, it's electric cars. So what is the biggest subsidy I've been waiting to tell you? This is a once-in-a-lifetime subsidy, which has never happened in human history. So you are living in historic times, never done in human history. And that is that all the governments around the globe has been holding interest rates at 0% and printing massive amount of money.
Third, the Bank of England has pumped £75 billion more into Britain's ailing economy with a new round of quantitative easing.
Message to the Eurozone from the European Central Bank's spanking new €1.3 billion headquarters in Frankfurt was straightforward. Interest rates will be held at an historic low of 0.05%. But President Mario Draghi said the bank will judge early next year if it needs to take more action, with the strongest indication yet the ECB could be willing to buy government debt.
0% interest rate made it cheaper to buy a house and cars, electric cars.
It's loan offers now. You can get a zero interest loan from Tesla for 5 years. Zero interest for 5 years. I mean, this seems insane.
The Electric Viking is correct. This seems insane. Why wouldn't people go out and buy a car when the financing 0%?
That's right, Tom. Get 0% APR on Edge or Explorer for 60 months.
Well, the problem is when interest rates go up, suddenly it's not 0% anymore. Suddenly it's 5%. And not only 5% on your car or maybe your Cybertruck.
This is the new Cybertruck. Oh. This is the new Cybertruck.
And suddenly you find yourself that your whole salary is going just to cover the 5% interest rate. And what are you gonna do then? Then you have to sell your car, sell your boat, downsize your house.
Melbourne has just recorded its sharpest property price fall in 18 months.
Just to keep your head above water.
So I want to read you something I got from Cox Automotive. As of July 2024, car repossessions in the United States are up 23% as the same period last year in 2023, and 14% higher than what it was in 2019. The increase is due to a combination of high interests and inflation, obviously. They didn't even mention raising car insurance, but I guess that goes with inflation, which has made car payments more expensive, and some say the spike in repossessions is a sign of consumer distress and potential economic downturn.
That's why doing these 0% interest rate experiments is a bad idea. Once rates go up to 7, 8, 9%, all these people that bought these cars and houses and everything have to downsize their life by a lot. And on top of that, if you lose your job, you're definitely in trouble. Bringing interest rates down to 0% were a huge mistake, and we're gonna pay a hefty price for it when interest rates go up. But it worries me that YouTube hasn't been profitable during these historic low rates. And since we're living in historic times, maybe I can teach the world all the mess the government makes with their policy and how we shouldn't have the government intervening in the economy. So if you want to help me educate the world, you can help support the channel on Patreon or becoming a member here on YouTube. And now you know, the next time house prices went down, it's because the government intervened in the economy. Same thing goes for electric cars. Thanks for watching.